Hello, good people. It's your boy T. Shees, Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, getter of the buckets. And what are we talking about today? We are continuing reviewing the affirmative action debate between the big homie Delano Squires, the conservative, sensible position, and of course, those on the left with their incoherent ideology. It abounds to this day. Why, I do not know, but we are going to uncover and expose it. I'm going to get right into it. This, to me, is really the meat of the discussion. It's the part of the discussion that gets my blood pressure up. I'm just going to keep it 100. And I respect to Delano because he actually keeps his composure. I would have probably been on 10, but that's why he's there and I'm not. So let's just jump right into it. We're not going to belabor. We're going to get right into it. Right now, they are starting a discussion on really what's the threshold. One of the young ladies on the panel asked a very sensible question, in my view. What is the threshold for affirmative action? When are we going to be done with it? When is it going to be good enough? And so this kicks off a very, very interesting response. So let's get into it.
But I will. So before we get to the polling, I do want to toss to Michael a pretty important question, I think, in all of this debate. Sandra Day O'Connor, I think, came around in her decision basically saying that it's a temporary measure and a stopgap measure. And I think it's predicated on that idea that it's trying to solve a problem. Like affirmative action wants to put itself out of business. Absolutely. And eventually, to your point, level the playing field. So at what threshold? And if there is a threshold, why are we not there yet? And that's hypothetical, or not hypothetical, but that's not a rhetorical question. That's actually sincere. What is the threshold at which affirmative action would no longer be necessary?
Good question.
When schools in Anacostia are as good as schools in Chevy Chase or in Northern Virginia, that I think is a threshold. When earning opportunities are the same, whether you're black or white, I think that's a threshold. But right now, your zip code determines your future. Where you grow up determines how much money you're gonna make, what your lifestyle is gonna be like, and I think that in and of itself is the problem. So when you talk about basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's problematic. Like, we're gonna be called affirmative action.
All right, let me just stop him there because this guy, the nonsense coming from this guy's face hole, it is hard to quantify. First of all, let's just start and talk about this. He said he made two claims here. First of all, that essentially your zip code determines your trajectory, which stands abundantly refuted by myself. I think I alluded to this on the first video, but you should know this about me. I grew up in Section 8 housing. We call that the projects in the hood, right? Section 8 housing. My mother was a single mom, 3 kids, right? And we were poor. Sometimes my mom didn't have the bill to pay basic utilities. We would come home sometimes and the lights would be out. It was like, why don't we have lights? Well, because we didn't pay the bill. That's why. So that's the kind of poor I was. Food stamps, the whole deal. I earn a very good living. I have a graduate degree in data science. I've said this before. And my brother has a graduate degree in education. He's actually a pastor as well now on staff. He's moved from education to ministry now. My sister is married to a pastor, but also she is a licensed cosmetologist and a cosmetology instructor. So we came out of that. Our zip code did not determine our trajectory. And I would like to say this. It's important to put some more meat on this. For me personally, I had a 1.7 GPA through my first 3 years of high school. Just think about that. 1.7. Now, the school that I went to, I lived pretty close to it, but it was a predominantly white school. I'm from South Carolina. I grew up in South Carolina. Anyway, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, but we moved to South Carolina when I was like 9 years old. So I don't tell people I'm from New York. I grew up in South Carolina for the most part. But we lived in an area where the school was decent, okay? Soxty High School, where I went to school, was a pretty good school. But I didn't take advantage of it. You see, just going to a good school doesn't mean anything if you don't take advantage of it. And the only reason that I really got into college is because I really wanted to play college basketball. And so at the end of the year, not the end of the year, but at the end of my high school career, my senior year in high school, I actually got serious about it because I knew that I would not be eligible unless I picked it up in the classroom. And so that's what I did. I picked it up in the classroom and I just got my GPA over that 2.0 threshold that was necessary to qualify to play NCAA basketball. Now, there was another side of that, which is that I had to score based on the sliding scale. I had to score 1,010 on my SAT, because the way it works for NCAA eligibility is that the higher your GPA is, the lower your test score can be. So, and SAT was more popular back then, as opposed to, I think, maybe ACT is starting to become the standard now. But basically, because my GPA was so low, I had to have the highest possible score from the NCAA standpoint perspective. That was the highest score they required in order for someone to be eligible. And it only required that for people who had a very low GPA, which was basically the minimum threshold. By God's providence and his grace, I got 1,020. I had one shot to take it. Now, that should tell you a couple of things. One is that I was very capable, but I just didn't do my work. That's the reason why my GPA was so low. And the reason why I didn't do my work is because I didn't have the structure at home to enforce me to have the discipline that it would take to secure my learning activities, to be diligent in my studies. I just didn't have the home environment for that. And my mother, in part, wasn't really, even though she wasn't able to do that, so she has some responsibility there. But my mother was sick when I was young. My mother actually died when I was 18 years old of cancer. So during those years when I was in high school, she was, we would basically have to get her to her chemotherapy sessions. She had a lot on her plate, okay? She was trying to stay alive. She didn't have any help. And so it was understandable that one of the last things on her mind was making sure I did my homework. She was just trying to make sure I wasn't out here in the street selling dope. Okay? That was a bigger priority for her. And the point that I'm making is this. The left always swears up and down that the answers to the issues that that ail society are within their control. They swear up and down they are the perfect and the ultimate social engineers. I was at a good school. I was at a decent school. I still was not achieving what I could have achieved because of what was going on at home. But thankfully, even though my mom couldn't stay on top of me with respect to my academic pursuits, she was able to shape me morally and spiritually, so that when I became of age and I finally, by God's providence and grace, earned a basketball scholarship, right around my senior year in high school is when I became a Christ follower. And when I got saved, I asked myself an interesting question. I said, you're much more capable of performing academically than you are capable. Is God honored? Is God being glorified with your lackadaisical and lazy approach to your academics? That was the question I asked myself. And the answer to that question was no. And in college, I was twice the student that I was in high school, not because of some leftist program, but because I took personal responsibility and my worldview dictated that I put forth the effort and take advantage of the opportunities that God put before me. And that's how I made the shift. So I didn't become a 4.0 student, but I was above a 3.0 GPA throughout my college years, particularly my sophomore and junior year. I did pretty well. I had a little lull my freshman year because I was just getting rid of those bad habits. And then my senior year had a little stumble because I had to take some biology classes that I didn't take seriously. Anyway, the point is that in my core classes in my major, I was well above a 3.0. I had one of the highest, basically proficiency scores, because you got to take an exam at the end of your senior year just to kind of give, I forget what you called it, that exam. I can't remember, but I was well within the top 10% decile, like the 90th percentile for test scores. So I was quite capable. But I had to take personal responsibility, and that stems back to your values and your family situation, that which cannot be controlled by leftist policies. Okay? So that's the first thing. That was a long drawn out. I was way longer than I expected to talk about that. But I want to say one other thing. And let me pull you in close here. The hypocrisy, this other thing that he said, that your zip code determines your trajectory, basically. Your zip code determines your income. You know, the one thing that these leftists are against over and over and over again, they are against school choice, which is ironic, right? Because here he's talking about how the schools need to change and the schools need to be better. But if a black person, a poor black person wants to go to a school that is not immediately in their zip code, and many people on the right have proposed ad nauseum the idea that the money should follow the student. Wherever the student goes, the money should follow them. People shouldn't be locked into poor and failing schools in their zip codes. Without fail, people on the left are against that. So you can miss me with this garbage because you aren't serious about it. The only way you want to control the levers of power is by imposing your ideology on people and so that you can ensure that people are indoctrinated in the ways that you want, not that people would have personal control and personal freedom and to take control of their own destiny. That's the one thing that people on the left cannot allow. Okay, I filibustered. Let's continue.
Hires, affirmative action, admittance, whether we're there or not. Like,
there are heavily white schools in Appalachia that are nowhere near Chevy Chase and are probably much more similar to Anacostia. So I guess why is race still the best proxy when it's a class conversation?
Because there's a historical factor to this.
Agree.
And when I get pulled over, they don't see me as lawyer Michael Hopkins.
Let me find this button here. My guy, nobody sees you as a threat. I'm just going to put that out there. This is just, it's like some religious statement, right? Well, black cops see the black man as a threat. No, not really. I don't want to belabor this point because this guy, I want to move on. I want to move on to this young lady here because she makes, once again, classic leftist argument, classic leftist idea of, well, we need to make more broad sweeping changes, not things that target specific groups, but more so things that target broader changes. And she starts to talk about things like child tax credits and what was the other thing? Anyway, let's just let her say it. Let's bring it in.
Let me ask you, this is kind of a critique from the left, which is, the policies that throughout American history have been most effective at actually reducing the racial wealth gap and reducing the racial wage gap have been universal policies. They've been lifting the minimum wage and making it apply to everyone, not having these carve-outs for professions that are historically disproportionately African American. Things like the child tax credit.
Absolutely.
That programs that are universal are, number one, more politically popular than affirmative action, which I think we could all agree. We can go ahead and throw the polling up on the screen, which just depends on how you ask the words, the language, or whatever. But it is a divisive issue. I think everybody can acknowledge that. So why not focus the political capital on something like increasing union density or lifting the minimum wage or achieving universal health care, which may actually be more effective at the goals that you and I both share?
Honestly, because Republicans won't agree to it. Like, we live in a democracy.
But Republicans aren't agreeing to this either.
Well, yeah, but this was built in. When LBJ put this system in, he said it's not enough to open the doors, but we've got to level the playing field so that people can walk through those doors.
Okay. So there you see it. Now, I've already exposed the nonsense of this guy talking about what Republicans won't agree to, why these people stand as a barrier to school choice, which would actually be something that would be a simple and immediate fix to some of the problems and questions that he's raising about the poor schools that many minorities are forced to go to. That aside, what this young lady, this anchor just introduced, is some of the most shocking and staggering displays of ignorance I've ever seen. She mentions minimum wage as something that lifts people out of poverty. Here's something that apparently most people don't understand about minimum wage. Minimum wages were introduced not to help poor people. Minimum wages were introduced to protect white workers from wage wars and wages where black and basically minorities or workers would undercut the wages. They would say, hey, we'll work for less. We'll do it for less. And it kept driving the wages down. And so they instituted a minimum wage, not to help the black people, but to help the whites from losing jobs based on wage wars. That's a fact. So whenever some leftist introduces minimum wage as some benevolent legislation to help poor people, it was introduced precisely for the opposite reason. Now, people like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell have done extensive research on the idea of minimum wage. And here's the thing about minimum wage that should be understood. There's a similar thing with abortion, for example. People always talk about abortion, how it's so great, and how we should get women access to kill their children. They deny the fact that Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, introduced Planned Parenthood for the specific reason of aborting and eliminating the black population, keeping minority populations down. That's why she created it. She didn't want to kill the white babies. She wanted to kill the black babies. That's why it was instituted. And to this day, it functions largely in that capacity, where the majority of the babies being aborted are in poor black neighborhoods. That was his express intent. It was racist from the beginning. And now we're championing it like it's some great, bastion of human freedom and hope. It's nonsense. So that's the skinny on minimum wage. The second thing is, the thing about minimum wage is, what's more important, I think, or just as important, is not just its intent, but its impact. Because the impact of minimum wage, as once again, people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams have documented ad nauseum, is that minimum wage has actually worked to the detriment of poor people. Minimum wage, this is the way Tom Sowell puts it. He said, how is it better for a person when minimum wage is introduced, that they go from making a low wage to making no wage at all? In other words, minimum wages, the unintended impact of it is that often it prices out low-skilled workers, right? And what we've seen is that as minimum wages, for example, has continued to rise, one of the main groups that we have seen kind of priced out of the labor market are teenagers. I remember getting jobs when I was like 12, 13 years old. I mean, not legal jobs, right? But like when I was like 14 years old, I remember working in restaurants and things like that. And I'm going to tell you something right now. Nobody's going to pay some 14, 15-year-old $15 an hour, okay? Right now, people are talking about fight for 15 and a living wage. You know what? If you're 15 years old, you're basically a liability when you first start working, because they got to teach you everything. You're not productive. So if you don't have $15 an hour skills, nobody's going to pay you $15 an hour. The other flawed thinking about minimum wage is that, hey, if minimum wage is so great, then why stop at 15? Why not 20? Why not 30? 30 is even better still. There's so many flaws with this ideology. And this is what the left never takes into account. They talk about what the intentions of these laws are, but they never talk about their impact. All right, let's listen further.
I would wonder, do you have a problem with legacy admission? Because that's affirmative action for white people. Like,
not necessarily. It's not.
It's not explicitly.
George W. Bush would not have gotten in Yale, but for the fact that his father was Herbert Walker Bush and his grandfather was Prescott Bush. So do we really think he earned the right?
Standard from Malia Obama?
So you can use one example.
No. I'm just asking you.
That's
third generation Harvard.
That is a red herring. So you take the first black president, and use his daughter as the one example of how affirmative action works.
Gosh, this is why I said Delano's just dominating this dude. This dude is getting so triggered. His answers are so incoherent. Why does it matter that he's using Michelle Obama and Barack Obama's children as a counterexample? Oh, because it's black? Because they're black, so now we should have a different standard for them? That's apparently what he thinks, and that's exactly Delano's point. This is not about equality. This is about equal, not unequal weights and measures, and we judge people differently based on whether or not they're black. How is that justice? Everything this guy is saying is incoherent. He's saying, we want equality. Therefore, as a means to equality, we want to treat people differently. Like, how does that make any sense?
I'm an equal weights and measures guy, right? So if it's like when the left talks about class and billionaires, right? Eat the rich. They love to talk about Bill Gates, but Oprah Winfrey's a billionaire. Is she included? So if you say you're against legacies,
How many black billionaires are there?
I have no idea.
Exactly.
But again,
there's
that's
not.
Again, we don't want to eat the black billionaires because there's not that many of them. So freaking what? It's not about how many of them there are. It's about the principle. And as the standard goes, the left would have no standards at all if they didn't have double standards.
Very many.
That's irrelevant to the point at hand. I like to focus. Racial preferences
irrelevant.
at selective universities don't have to do with how the police see you or all these other issues, because at the end of the day, that does not correct the issues in K through 12 education. And one of the things that the left does not
A result
speak
of
about,
redlining.
we can get that's.
There he goes again for that super invincible Mario star. Redlining. Everything is redlining. I got to kill this sacred cow of redlining, because people on the left swear up and down that is a valid answer to everything that has to do with race. Redlining.
It's a different segment. One of the things that the left does not speak about as it relates to education is family, home environment, the ethnic breakdown, Asian, white, Hispanic, black, that you see in admittance rate to Harvard tracks SAT scores. It tracks the number of hours that students spend on homework.
Yes.
Both the number of hours and the percentage of students that spend 5 days a week doing homework.
Correct.
But then what the left says is, no, we have to correct these issues at Harvard and Duke and North Carolina.
But Delano, I don't think that's actually fair, as someone who has had some critiques of the affirmative action policy, because the left does talk about things like child tax credit, things like paid sick leave.
Okay, so now she's going back to the child tax credit, and this is a category mistake. And you got to watch these people, because they so often, so sneakily slip in things that are incongruent and that are category errors. And if you're not careful, you'll be taken by their rhetoric. Delano's talking about, what is he talking about? Personal responsibility, culture in the home, discipline, work ethic, things that you learn at home. And what does she shift the conversation to? Child tax credits. What does a child tax credit have to do with the culture that you have in the home? What does that have to do with that? Moreover, and this is not even, I don't even need to get into this, but it's a worthwhile discussion. A child tax credit is effectively a transfer of money from those who pay excess in taxes to those who pay less. So it's effectively a wealth transfer is what it is. Now, as a person who is the recipient of a child tax credit, because I don't make enough money to, and that doesn't mean that I don't have to pay taxes. That just means that my tax burden is lower, which I appreciate, and it's fine. But that's a separate question. Whether I benefit from it is a separate question of whether I am entitled to it. And the same thing goes with universal health care. And I don't even think the case can be made, even if we assume that universal health care and that sort of thing actually has an economic benefit, which I don't think that it will, because all it will do is take a limited commodity and spread it out to a bunch of people so that there'll be less of it available for everyone. So it'll be, quote, cheaper, but it'll be much, much worse and much less efficient. But that's a separate question. Even if it wasn't a significant drop off in its general quality and efficiency, the question is, am I entitled? On what basis am I entitled to someone else's labor and someone else's money? Because that's effectively what she's talking about. People should give poor people things. Well, why? What principle do you appeal to say somebody who is poor is owed money by somebody who is rich? On what basis do we make that claim? Oh, because of equality. Equality in why is equality some necessary good that we should pursue, even though it requires that you take from people who didn't earn something and give them something that they didn't earn? Or you take from people, I should say, that earn something and give it to someone who didn't earn it. All right, let's continue.
Things like paid family leave, which may not be the way that you talk about families.
Correct.
But is certainly a policy that helps support families, helps
It's not the way he talks about families because it's not something that's within the family's control.
enable people to have families, helps enable people to have healthy families and maintain a marriage, which could be under a lot of financial stress. So I don't think it's fair to say that this is the only.
Yeah, if people just had more money, they wouldn't get divorced as much. Yeah, rich people don't get divorced. Is that true? This is so idiotic.
Policy that they focus on when there are a broad range of policies that have been discussed and some of them implemented even under the Biden administration that are targeted directly at families.
I think it's interesting that you say that. Let's go back to a Harvard alum. President Barack Obama, to his credit, and I will give him credit for this, is the last president I can think of, particularly the last Democrat, national Democrat, who regularly spoke about the importance of marriage, fatherhood, and family as it related to social outcomes. In 2016 and 2020, the Democratic National Party took those references out of their party platform.
Facts.
And now, if you want to talk about family, it's child tax credit, it's maternal health care. And I'm not against any of those things. I'm not against, paid family leave. But that's a different conversation than saying the ideal situation for every child in this country is to be raised by two married biological parents in a low-conflict, loving home.
Hold on. The job of the federal government, though, is to set the policy landscape, right? It's not to get into people's lives and tell them you should be married or you shouldn't be married. You can, by having a policy of, for example, the child tax credit.
The job of the federal government is not to tell people they should be married. Why isn't it? And Delano will point this out. They certainly seem to think it's their job to tell people, white people, how they ought to feel about black people. It's certainly their quote unquote job to tell people how they ought to feel about mutilating their child's genitals. It certainly is apparently their job to tell people, what they should think about equality. They don't mind imposing their supposed standards on people until it comes to the things that actually matter, until it comes to things that actually have this sort of impact that will strengthen individuals by strengthening the family. They don't want strong families because they can't control them. And literally this woman is sitting here suggesting that the federal government has a right and an obligation to underwrite irresponsible behavior. This is what I want to ask her if she's making this idiotic claim. Okay, let's say somebody in your family that you know is a derelict and a loser. Every time someone gives them an opportunity or tries to give them a leg up, they blow it, right? They go out and blow their opportunities by doing drugs, sleeping around, making a bunch of irresponsible decisions. Are you going to still, once you know someone has demonstrated that that's what they're going to do with the help that you give them and the opportunities you present, are you still going to take your money and your time and your energy and continue to invest in that person? Would you take your personal money and keep dumping it into someone who blows it on drugs, goes out and gets pregnant, has a bunch of babies out of wedlock? Is that what you're going to do? Because that's what she's suggesting the federal government does. And this is such a demonic and pernicious view that she's advocating. And from the left it is so pernicious, and we need to be calling it out. But shout out to Delano because he does that. Let's listen further.
Or lifting wages so people can afford to support a family. That's the job of the federal government. So that's why it makes sense that is the conversation that is happening at that level. And by the way, I do find it, you're talking about what the left does, et cetera, I find it very selective that the right loves to claim they care about families and might even say, like, oh, in theory, I support child tax credit. But when brass tacks came, I didn't see any Republicans supporting the extension of a child.
Again, do you understand the difference between advocating for parental and familial responsibility and what is effectively a benevolence. Nobody owes you a child tax credit. You're not owed a credit on your taxes. You didn't earn it. It doesn't belong to you, but you do have a right and a responsibility, more specifically, to care for your children and to put them in an environment that allows them to flourish. That's your responsibility as a parent. Don't try to notice the implication of the paternal relationship that she is implying between the federal government and the person and the individual in the family. She's saying that the federal government should take on the paternal role, which is exactly what we've been saying about the left all along. They want to be your masters. They want to be your controllers. They want you dependent on them. They want you to go to them like they're your dad with your hand out. It's absurd.
Tax credit.
And I'll just very quickly, because I think you're going to say something similar. As the welfare state has expanded, so has fatherlessness among not just black kids, but kids in general.
Expanding.
That's a fact.
Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it. So the idea that the welfare state is expanding, I think, is belied by the evidence.
I'm sorry. This chick is so dense. She is so dense.
Pretty stark contrast pre-LBJ and post-LBJ. Right. And the trajectory of the black family has been one direction since then. And we may disagree about correlation there, but it is clear that since America created a bigger welfare state, fatherlessness has expanded.
That's 1,000% a fact.
But like you have to look at crime for that. I mean, when you look at the fact that you've put black people in neighborhoods because of redlining, because of historical
redlining again,
put them in neighborhoods.
There's that redlining
schools,
again.
Lack of job opportunities. Anacostia doesn't even have grocery stores until like 5 years ago, and so you set people up for failure. And then basically say, but it's your fault.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit because there's.
I want to respond to the
Go ahead,
point
respond to the point.
I agree. The job of the federal government is to set policy, right?
Yeah.
But politicians, including the president, they have a purse, they have a pen, and they have a pulpit. And politicians have no problem using their bully pulpit to say, you should think this. The last, particularly 3 years.
Do you really think that if Joe Biden got up there and said, you should stay married, or you should, there's so many other factors that go into that. I don't think that would solve the problem.
Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
I take the position
this woman is
that
insufferable.
In city after city across this country, if every sign that said Black Lives Matter said marriage before carriage, and every politician was as resolute in talking about the importance of the natural family as they are about telling white folks how they should feel about black people, I do think that would make a difference.
Have you met Donald Trump? You can't talk about family in the left.
Trump is not my standard, but continue.
Of course, we can't have any conversation without some sort of manifestation of Trump deranged syndrome. But you get the point. I think that's pretty much where we should end it there. We have learned that the left and their ideologies are so self-evidently incoherent and wrong and hypocritical when it comes to these issues, because anytime you hear these conversations, you're going to see some iteration of these talking points: redlining, universal health care, child tax credit, blah, 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 white people started on third base and we started on first base and therefore we need a leg up. You're going to hear all of those things ad nauseum repeated over and over and over again. But no matter what is being said here, the bottom line is this: no progress will be made among black people until black people learn how to overcome and deal with their own problems. That was a view that Malcolm X held. That's a view that I hold. And at the end of the day, black people are not going to make the sort of progress that we are hoping black people make at the behest of the government, or more broadly, the benevolence of white people. Black outputs are not a function of white inputs. Black outputs are a function of black inputs. And until we understand that, there will never be any real progress made. Anyway, friends, I appreciate you sticking with me. If you stayed this long, I appreciate your perspective and your feedback. Leave me a comment, drop a like, tell somebody about this channel if you appreciate the content. Until next time, friends, God bless you.